Sometimes the greatest regrets come from the things we throw away too quickly. In 1880s Arizona, old prospector Silas has spent years cursing his stubborn donkey, calling him worthless and slow. Fed up and broken down, Silas sells the animal to a quiet cowboy for pocket change and whiskey. But that cowboy, Elias Kane, sees something different in the humble beast. As they journey into the Sierra Madres, the donkey begins showing supernatural ability to find water, shelter, and safe passage. What Elias discovers next will change both men's lives forever, teaching Silas that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as burdens. But what was it about this simple donkey that held the power to transform two broken men's destinies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and rust. Silas Boone emerged from Murphy's boarding house like a man carrying the weight of all his 67 years on his bent shoulders. His arthritic fingers wrapped around a steaming tin cup of coffee, the only luxury he still permitted himself. In these lean times, the leather journal tucked under his arm told the story of 2 decades in these unforgiving hills. Its pages, yellowed and brittle from desert heat, contained careful notations of failed claims, dry holes, and promises that never materialized. Each entry marked another day of back-breaking labor that yielded nothing but disappointment and deeper lines around his weathered eyes. "Morning, Silas," called Tom Murphy from the boarding house porch, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to treat his tenants with diplomacy. "Heading out to the claims again?" Silas grunted in response, not trusting his voice to betray the growing desperation that gnawed at his gut like hunger. 3 months behind on his rent, with winter approaching and his savings reduced to the few coins that rattled lonely in his coat pocket. The journal under his arm felt heavier each morning, weighted down with the accumulated evidence of his failures. In the dusty lot behind the boarding house, Rotgut stood tethered to a weathered hitching post, his grey coat dulled by years of desert sun and neglect. The donkey raised his head at Silas's approach, dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that the old prospector had long since stopped acknowledging. To Silas, the beast represented nothing more than another burden, another mouth to feed when he could barely afford to feed himself. "Move along, you worthless creature," Silas muttered, loading his meager supplies onto the donkey's back with movements made clumsy by swollen joints. The pack saddle, worn thin from years of use, creaked under the weight of his prospecting tools, a short-handled pick, a rusty pan, and a canvas sack that had seen better decades. Rotgut accepted the load without complaint, as he had every morning. For the past 3 years, the donkey had come to Silas through a poker game, won from a Mexican trader who claimed the animal possessed qualities beyond the ordinary. But Silas had seen nothing extraordinary in the beast, only stubbornness, slowness, and an infuriating tendency to stop exactly where Silas didn't want him to. The walk to his current claim stretched 2 miles into the hills, following a path that wound between sagebrush and scattered boulders. Silas's boots, worn thin at the heels, crunched against the gravelly trail, while Rotgut's hooves provided a steady counterpoint rhythm. The silence between man and beast spoke of years of mutual resignation. As they climbed, Silas pulled out his journal and flipped to yesterday's entry. Claim Night 47, still nothing. Ground harder than my father's heart. Water table dropped another. Foot, beginning to wonder if this whole stretch is played out. The words stared back at him like an accusation, written in the careful script his schoolteacher mother had beaten into him decades ago. The current claim occupied a narrow gulch where winter runoff had carved a channel through red sandstone. Other prospectors had worked this area before. Silas could see the telltale signs of their efforts in the scattered rock piles and abandoned shafts. But something in his prospector's instincts told him they'd missed something, some hidden vein. That patient work might uncover he'd been wrong before. The journal contained 46 previous examples of his flawed judgment. "Easy now," he said to Rotgut as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. The donkey had stopped, as he often did, seeming to study the terrain ahead with an intensity that irritated Silas. "We don't have all day for your contemplation," but Rotgut didn't move. The animal stood perfectly still, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring slightly, as if testing the air for something Silas couldn't detect. This was the behavior that frustrated the old prospector most: the donkey's inexplicable pauses, his refusal to proceed until some internal signal gave him permission to continue. "Stubborn as the day is long," Silas grumbled, tugging on the lead rope. "If you had half the sense God gave a rock, we might actually accomplish something." After a full minute, Rotgut resumed walking, picking his way carefully around a section of loose shale that Silas hadn't even noticed. The old man attributed this to random chance rather than any particular wisdom on the animal's part. In his experience, donkeys were creatures of habit and instinct, nothing more. At the claim site, Silas went through his daily ritual of examining the previous day's work. The shallow hole he'd been digging showed no more promise than it had 24 hours earlier. Just red dirt, scattered quartz, and the occasional fool's gold that quickened his pulse before revealing its true worthless nature. He opened his journal to a fresh page and began writing. Day 23, claim W47, still breaking ground. Rotgut balked at the eastern section again. Need to push deeper near the water seep. His handwriting, once precise and confident, now wavered slightly from the tremor that had begun in his right hand. Another reminder of his advancing years. The work began, as it always did, with the rhythmic strike of his pick against stone and earth. Each swing sent jolts of pain through his arthritic shoulders, but Silas had long ago learned to work through discomfort. The desert demanded persistence above all other virtues, and he'd given it 20 years of his life in exchange for promises that remained unfulfilled. Rotgut wandered to the shade of a scraggly juniper tree, where he stood with the patience of a creature accustomed to long waits. Occasionally, the donkey would lift his head and gaze toward the eastern hills, toward terrain that Silas had never bothered to explore. The animal's attention seemed drawn to something beyond the horizon, but Silas had stopped paying attention to such behavior years ago. As the sun climbed higher, the old prospector's movements grew slower and more labored. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the autumn chill, and his breathing came in increasingly harsh gasps. The shallow hole yielded nothing but more red dirt, and the growing certainty that claim number 47 would join its predecessors in his journal's catalogue of failures. During his noon rest, Silas sat in the meager shade beside Rotgut and opened his journal to the first entry, made 20 years ago with the enthusiasm of a young man convinced that fortune lay just beneath the next layer of stone. Arrived in Copper Ridge, country. Looks promising. Plenty of water, good rock formations. Should have my stake within the year. The optimism in those faded words felt like mockery now. He flipped through the pages, each one documenting another failure, another false hope, another reminder that the territory had given up its easy riches to other men in other years. Names he'd once known, Henderson, Carlyle, the Martinez brothers, had all moved on to other prospects or other lives. Only Silas remained, stubborn as the donkey beside him, unwilling to admit defeat. "We're a matched pair, aren't we?" he said to Rotgut, who responded by swishing his tail at a persistent fly. "Too stupid to know when we're beat." The afternoon brought more of the same, backbreaking labor, incremental progress, and the gradual accumulation of disappointment. As shadows began to lengthen, Silas faced the familiar reality that another day had passed without discovery, without hope, without any indication that tomorrow would differ from today. The walk back to Copper Ridge passed in familiar silence. Rotgut picked his way down the trail with sure footing, while Silas struggled to maintain his balance on loose stones. His legs, never strong to begin with, had grown increasingly unreliable over the years. More than once, the donkey's steady presence had prevented a fall that might have ended his prospecting days permanently. As they approached the town, Silas could see lights beginning to flicker in windows along the main street. Murphy's boarding house promised a meager supper and a narrow cot, but little comfort for a man facing the gradual erosion of his dreams. The journal under his arm felt heavier than ever, weighted down with the accumulated evidence of a life spent chasing shadows in the desert. Tomorrow would bring another entry, another failure to document in his careful script. But tonight, as he settled Rotgut in the small corral behind the boarding house, Silas allowed himself a moment of honesty about the growing certainty that his time in these hills was drawing to a close. The territory had tested him for 20 years, and he was finally beginning to understand that he might not possess whatever quality separated successful prospectors from dreamers. He patted Rotgut's neck with a gentleness that surprised them both. "At least you've been steady company," he admitted quietly, "even if you are the most stubborn creature the Lord ever made." The donkey's dark eyes regarded him with what might have been understanding, or might have been simple animal patience. Either way, it was more sympathy than Silas expected to receive from any other source in Copper Ridge. The opportunity came 3 days later in the form of Franklin Hess, a prospector from Colorado with money to invest and a willingness to partner with local men who knew the territory. Silas had heard about Hess from Murphy, who mentioned that the visitor was looking for someone to guide him to the more promising claims in the eastern hills. For the first time in months, Silas felt a spark of genuine hope. A partnership could mean capital for proper equipment, supplies to last through winter, and perhaps most importantly, validation that his 20 years in these hills had taught him something of value. He spent the morning preparing his best sales pitch, selecting samples from his more promising claims, and rehearsing the speech that might change his fortunes. The meeting was arranged for noon at the site of Claim 447. Silas arrived early, his tools arranged to suggest productive activity, his journal opened to pages that emphasized potential rather than failure. Rotgut stood tethered nearby, loaded with extra supplies to demonstrate Silas's preparedness for serious mining operations. Franklin Hess proved to be a serious man in his 40s, well-dressed by frontier standards and possessed of the kind of quiet confidence that spoke of successful ventures elsewhere. He examined Silas's work with the practiced eye of someone who understood both the promise and the pitfalls of prospecting. "The formation looks promising," Hess admitted, running his fingers through a handful of crushed quartz. "Good water access, decent access for equipment. What's your assessment of the deeper veins?" Silas launched into his carefully prepared presentation, pointing out the geological indicators that suggested richer deposits below the surface. He spoke of favorable rock formations, promising mineral traces, and the proven productivity of similar claims in adjacent territories. For 20 minutes, he felt like the experienced prospector he'd always imagined himself to be. Hess listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and seemed genuinely interested in the possibilities. When he suggested they examine the eastern approach to the claim, Silas readily agreed. This was the kind of thorough investigation that serious businessmen conducted, and he welcomed the chance to demonstrate his knowledge of the terrain. They walked to where Rotgut waited, loaded with the additional supplies Silas had brought to impress his potential partner. The eastern route required climbing over a rocky outcrop that offered the best view of the claim's potential expansion areas. It was steep but manageable, and Silas had made the journey countless times. "Come on, you lazy beast," Silas said to Rotgut, tugging on the lead rope. "We need to show Mr. Hess the overlook." The donkey didn't move. He stood planted like a statue, ears back, regarding the rocky trail ahead with obvious reluctance. This was Rotgut's most infuriating behavior, his inexplicable refusal to proceed when Silas needed him most. "Move along," Silas commanded, pulling harder on the rope. "We don't have time for your stubbornness today." Rotgut remained motionless. The donkey's dark eyes seemed to study the terrain ahead with intense concentration, as if detecting some danger that escaped both men. His nostrils flared slightly, testing the air, and he shifted his weight backward rather than forward. Hess watched this performance with growing impatience. "Perhaps we should unload the supplies and make the climb on foot." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. This was exactly the kind of impression he couldn't afford to make, that of an old man who couldn't even control his own pack animal. He's just being contrary. He'll move when he decides to, but as the minutes passed, Rotgut's resistance only intensified. The donkey began backing away from the trail, forcing Silas to brace his feet to maintain his grip on the rope. What had begun as simple stubbornness now looked like open rebellion in front of the one man whose opinion could change Silas's future. "This is unacceptable," Silas muttered, his voice rising with frustration. "I said move." He grabbed a stick from the ground and waved it threateningly. "You worthless contrary." The stick never connected. As Silas raised his arm, his arthritic shoulder seized with a sharp pain that sent the improvised switch tumbling from his fingers. The moment of weakness, displayed so publicly in front of his potential partner, felt like the final humiliation in a life increasingly defined by small defeats. Hess checked his pocket watch with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Boone, I have other appointments this afternoon. Perhaps we could reschedule when your animal is more cooperative." The dismissal in his voice was unmistakable. Silas recognized the tone of a businessman who had just crossed a potential investment off his list. "Mr. Hess, please. The donkey's just—" "I understand these things happen," Hess interrupted, but his expression suggested otherwise. "When you have your operation running more smoothly, feel free to contact me again." Silas watched his last real hope walk away, carrying with it the possibility of partnership, capital, and redemption. The sound of Hess's boots crunching down the trail seemed to echo his own footsteps over 20 years of failed ventures. When the businessman disappeared around a bend, Silas found himself alone with his rage and the donkey who had just cost him everything. 20 years, he said aloud, his voice shaking with accumulated fury. 20 years I've fed you, sheltered you, and put up with your contrary nature, and this is how you repay me? Rotgut regarded him with the same calm patience he'd shown throughout the confrontation, as if the collapse of Silas's dreams was merely another passing event in a donkey's quiet existence. The walk back to Copper Ridge passed in brooding silence. Silas's mind raced through the implications of the lost opportunity, how long his remaining money would last, whether Murphy would grant him more time on the rent, what options remained for a 67-year-old man with failing health and no prospects. Each question led to darker possibilities until he felt suffocated by the weight of his circumstances. By the time they reached the main street, Silas had made his decision. He couldn't afford to maintain a useless animal, especially one whose behavior actively sabotaged his efforts to improve his situation. If Rotgut wouldn't serve as a proper pack animal, then he had no purpose in Silas's increasingly desperate existence. The first person he encountered was a stranger, a tall, lean man in his 30s with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. The stranger wore simple clothes well maintained, and his horse, a sturdy bay mare, stood quietly at the hitching rail outside McDonald's general store. "Excuse me," Silas called out, surprised by the desperation he heard in his own voice. "You wouldn't be interested in purchasing a pack animal, would you?" The stranger turned, revealing a face marked by sun and wind, but gentle around the eyes. There was something in his expression, a quality of careful attention that suggested he listened more than he spoke. "Depends on the animal," he said quietly. "This donkey," Silas gestured to Rotgut, "strong, experienced with mining operations. I'm looking to liquidate some assets." It wasn't entirely a lie, though the stranger's careful examination of both man and beast suggested he understood more about the situation than Silas's careful words revealed. The man approached Rotgut slowly, extending his hand for the donkey, to examine before attempting to touch him. "What's his name?" the stranger asked. "Rotgut," Silas replied, then immediately wished he'd chosen something more appealing. On account of his stubborn nature, the stranger smiled slightly at this, running his hands along Rotgut's neck and shoulders with obvious familiarity with animals. The donkey stood quietly under the examination, displaying none of the contrary behavior that had characterized the morning's disaster. "He seems sound," the stranger observed. "Good feet, clear eyes. What are you asking?" Silas had given no thought to price, driven more by the need to rid himself of the source of his humiliation than by any economic calculation. $20, he said, then immediately wondered if he should have asked for more. "I can offer $12 and a flask of whiskey," the stranger replied. "It's good whiskey." The negotiation felt surreal to Silas. 3 hours ago, he'd been presenting himself as a serious prospector to a potential business partner. Now he was haggling over the sale of his only remaining asset to a complete stranger in the dusty street of a frontier town. But the $12 represented more than Silas currently possessed, and the whiskey offered temporary escape from the growing certainty that his dreams had finally died. "Done," he said. The stranger, who introduced himself as Elias Kane, completed the transaction with the efficiency of someone accustomed to such dealings. He counted out 12 silver dollars into Silas's palm and produced a small flask from his saddlebags. The whiskey was indeed good, as promised, better than anything Silas had tasted in months. As Elias transferred Rotgut's lead rope to his own hand, Silas felt an unexpected pang of regret. The donkey had been his companion for 3 years, sharing the daily routine of hope and disappointment that defined a prospector's existence. There had been moments, not many, but some, when Rotgut's presence had provided comfort in the vast loneliness of the desert. "He's a good animal," Silas found himself saying. "Just stubborn, needs a firm hand." Elias nodded gravely, as if accepting both the donkey and the responsibility that came with him. "I appreciate the recommendation. May I ask what you plan to do next?" The question caught Silas off guard. Most business transactions ended with the exchange of money and goods, but this stranger seemed genuinely interested in his welfare. "Continue." "In prospecting," Silas replied, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered how that would be possible without a pack animal. "The territory's been good to you?" Elias asked. Silas looked at the $12 in his palm, thought of his failing claims and mounting debts, and managed a bitter laugh. "The territory takes what it wants and gives back what it chooses. Today it chose to give me enough money for a decent meal and a warm place to sleep." Something flickered in Elias's expression, not pity exactly, but a kind of understanding that suggested he'd known disappointment himself. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and its cover stained with what might have been blood. "My father kept a journal during the war," Elias said quietly. "Wrote in it every day for 3 years. Toward the end, he started writing about more than just battles and marches. Started writing about the things he'd learned, the places he wanted to see, the way a man might find his purpose if he looked hard enough." Silas wasn't sure why this stranger was sharing such personal information, but something in Elias's tone commanded attention. Did he find it? His purpose? "He died at Gettysburg," Elias replied simply, "but he left me the journal. And sometimes, when I'm not sure which direction to travel, I read his words and find guidance." With that, Elias touched his hat brim in farewell and began leading Rotgut toward the edge of town. Silas watched them go, man and donkey walking steadily toward the eastern hills, until they disappeared behind a rise in the road. Standing alone in the dusty street with $12 and a flask of whiskey, Silas felt the weight of his decision, settling around him like desert silence. For better or worse, he had severed his last connection to the life he'd built in these hills. What came next remained to be seen. Elias Kane made camp that first evening 5 miles east of Copper Ridge, in a sheltered grove where cottonwoods grew thick enough to provide privacy from the main trail. The location wasn't chosen randomly. His father's journal had taught him to look for certain markers in unfamiliar territory, and this spot offered everything a careful traveler required: water, shelter, and clear sightlines in all directions. As he unsaddled his mare and arranged his modest supplies, Elias spoke quietly to Rotgut in the same measured tones he might use with an old friend. "We'll take our time getting acquainted," he said, checking the donkey's hooves for stones. "No need to rush into anything." The difference in treatment was immediately apparent. Where Silas had yanked and commanded, Elias moved with deliberate gentleness. He examined the worn spots on Rotgut's hide where the pack saddle had rubbed, noting the evidence of years spent carrying heavy loads across rough terrain. There were no wounds, but the donkey's coat showed the dullness that came from minimal care and maximum labor. "You've been working hard for a long time," Elias observed, running his hands along Rotgut's flanks. "A creature deserves better than that." From his saddlebags, Elias retrieved a hand-carved wooden cross, no larger than his palm, worn smooth by decades of handling. It had been his father's, carried through 3 years of war and countless miles of uncertain travel afterward. The simple wood bore no decorative carving, no gilt or precious metal, just the honest craftsmanship of a man who'd needed something to hold on to during the darkest hours of his life. Elias placed the cross on a flat stone beside his bedroll, where it caught the last rays of sunset filtering through the cottonwood leaves. This had been his evening ritual since leaving home 6 months ago, following the guidance his father had left in the stained pages of his war journal. The cross served as both prayer focus and reminder that his journey carried purpose beyond his own desires. "Lord," he said quietly while Rotgut grazed nearby, "thank you for the day's safe travel and for bringing this animal into my care. Help me be worthy of the trust placed in me, both by the man who sold him and by whatever plan you have for our journey ahead." As darkness settled over the desert, Elias opened his father's journal to the entry that had drawn him west. The handwriting grew shakier toward the end, as if written by a man fighting fever or exhaustion. "The war taught me that a man's purpose isn't always revealed in the places he expects to find it. Sometimes the Lord sends guidance through the humblest messengers, a word from a stranger, a path revealed by circumstance, even the wisdom of simple creatures who see more clearly than we do. If I don't return, may Elias remember that blessing often wears working clothes and speaks with a voice that most people don't bother to hear." The next few pages contained rough maps and notes about mineral formations in the Arizona Territory, gleaned from conversations with fellow soldiers who'd prospected before the war. But more interesting were the spiritual observations scattered throughout, reminders to remain humble, to treat all creatures with respect, to recognize that material wealth meant nothing without the wealth of character. Elias had memorized these passages during 6 months of travel, but he read them again by firelight while Rotgut stood quietly at the edge of the camp. The donkey's behavior struck him as unusual, not restless or anxious like most animals in unfamiliar surroundings, but alert and watchful, as if standing guard over their small camp. "You're different from other pack animals I've known," Elias said to the donkey. "Makes me wonder what that prospector really saw when he looked at you." As if responding to the comment, Rotgut lifted his head and gazed toward the eastern hills, toward territory that Elias's map marked as largely unexplored. The donkey's attention seemed focused on something specific rather than random, though what it might be remained unclear in the darkness. Morning brought the first real test of their partnership. Elias had planned to follow the established trail toward the Sierra Madres, but when he began loading supplies onto Rotgut's back, the donkey moved steadily toward a different path, one that angled northwest toward more broken country. That's not the way I intended to go, Elias said gently, but he made no effort to force the issue. Something in his father's journal had emphasized the importance of remaining open to unexpected guidance, and this seemed like a moment to practice that teaching. The path Rotgut chose proved more challenging than the main trail, winding between rock formations and crossing several dry washes that showed signs of dangerous flash flooding during the rainy season. But as they climbed higher into the hills, Elias began to understand the donkey's reasoning. By mid-morning, they'd gained enough elevation to see back toward Copper Ridge and the surrounding mining claims. From this vantage point, the pattern of human activity became clear. Most prospectors had focused their efforts in the easily accessible areas near established water sources, leaving the more difficult terrain largely untouched. "Smart," Elias murmured, studying the landscape. "Avoid the picked-over ground and look where other folks haven't bothered to search." More impressive was Rotgut's apparent ability to navigate terrain that would challenge experienced mountain men. The donkey picked his way across loose shale with sure footing, paused before crossing areas that looked solid but proved unstable, and consistently chose routes that minimized both effort and risk. When they stopped for their midday rest, Elias consulted his father's journal again. One passage seemed particularly relevant. "Watched a supply mule lead our column around a section of road that looked perfectly safe. 2 hours later, Confederate artillery destroyed the exact spot where we would have been," the sergeant said. "The mule could smell gunpowder from a mile away, but I think it was something else, the kind of awareness that comes from trusting your instincts instead of your assumptions." As if to reinforce this point, Rotgut suddenly lifted his head from grazing and walked to a section of seemingly barren ground 50 yards from their rest spot. The donkey began pawing at the earth with one hoof, creating small divots in the hard-packed soil. Elias followed, curious about this behavior. Where Rotgut had been digging, the ground felt different, softer somehow, with a subtle dampness that wasn't apparent on the surface. Elias scraped away a few inches of dirt and found what the donkey had somehow detected: a small seep where groundwater collected just below the surface. "Well, I'll be," Elias said softly. "How did you know that?" "Was there." The water was clear and cold, better than anything they'd found along the main trail. Elias filled his canteens and watered both animals, marveling at Rotgut's apparent ability to locate resources that escaped human observation. As they prepared to continue their journey, Elias reflected on the morning's events. Either he'd purchased the luckiest donkey in the territory, or there was something genuinely unusual about the animal's capabilities. His father's journal had prepared him to expect guidance from unexpected sources, but he hadn't anticipated it would come quite so. Literally, "Whatever you are," he said to Rotgut while adjusting the pack saddle, "I'm grateful for your company, and I promise you'll be treated with the respect you deserve." The donkey's dark eyes regarded him with what might have been approval or might have been simple animal patience. Either way, Elias felt a growing certainty that his journey had taken an important turn the moment he'd encountered that desperate prospector in Copper Ridge. As they resumed their travel toward the eastern hills, following paths that no map had ever recorded, Elias found himself thinking less about his planned destination and more about remaining open to whatever discoveries lay ahead. His father's cross, safely tucked in his shirt pocket, seemed to radiate a quiet warmth that spoke of blessings already beginning to unfold. The afternoon brought more evidence of Rotgut's unusual abilities. The donkey consistently chose routes that avoided unstable ground, located water sources that weren't visible from the surface, and displayed an uncanny sense for weather changes before they became apparent to human observation. By evening, when they made camp in another sheltered grove, Elias had begun to suspect that his $12 and flask of whiskey had purchased something far more valuable than a simple pack animal. As he placed his father's cross on its customary stone and offered his evening prayers, he included special thanks for whatever providence had guided him to that particular street corner at exactly the right moment. "Tomorrow we'll see what other surprises you have in store," he said to Rotgut, who stood at the edge of their camp with his usual watchful patience. "But tonight, I'm just grateful for the reminder that the Lord works in ways that often exceed our understanding." The second day of their partnership brought challenges that tested both Elias's patience and his growing faith in Rotgut's abilities. They'd been climbing steadily since dawn, following a series of animal trails that seemed to lead nowhere in particular, when storm clouds began gathering over the eastern peaks with ominous speed. Elias studied the darkening sky with concern. Desert storms could turn deadly without warning, transforming dry washes into raging torrents and creating flash floods that swept away everything in their path. His instinct was to seek immediate shelter in the rocky overhangs they'd passed an hour earlier, but Rotgut had other ideas. The donkey increased his pace rather than slowing, leading them higher into terrain that offered less protection than more. When Elias gently tugged on the lead rope to suggest an alternative direction, Rotgut planted his feet and refused to budge, the same behavior that had so frustrated his previous owner. "I hope you know what you're doing," Elias murmured, choosing trust over prudence, because those clouds look like they mean business. The donkey resumed walking, but his route now angled toward what appeared to be an impassable cliff face. As they drew closer, Elias began to doubt his decision to follow the animal's lead. The rock wall rose nearly vertical for 100 feet, offering no apparent shelter and no way forward. Then Rotgut disappeared. One moment the donkey was walking ahead of him, the next he'd vanished entirely. Elias hurried forward to discover a narrow cleft in the rock face, invisible from more than a few yards away, opening into a natural cave system that extended deep into the mountainside. The timing proved perfect. As Elias led his mare into the sheltered space, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the storm unleashed its fury on the hills outside, thunder, lightning, and a downpour so intense it turned the air grey with water. From their secure refuge, they watched flash floods rage through channels that had been dry stream beds an hour earlier. "That's twice you've kept us from trouble," Elias said to Rotgut, who stood calmly near the cave entrance as if surveying his handiwork. Starting to think that prospector didn't know what he was selling. While they waited for the storm to pass, Elias explored the cave system with the aid of a coal oil lantern. The passages extended further than his light could penetrate, but what he could see suggested long-term shelter possibilities. Fresh water seeped from the rock walls in several places, and the main chamber was large enough to house both animals comfortably. More interesting were the rock formations themselves. Elias was no geologist, but his father's journal contained enough mining wisdom to recognize promising mineral signs. The cave walls showed distinct layering, with veins of quartz running through the older rock in patterns that suggested interesting possibilities. As he examined one particularly striking formation, his lantern light caught something that made him pause. A section of quartz vein showed distinct metallic flecking, not the brassy glitter of fool's gold, but something with a different quality entirely. Elias chipped away a small sample with his pocket knife and held it close to the flame. Silver, not a massive deposit, but unmistakable silver traces threading through the quartz matrix like frozen lightning. The sample was small enough to fit in his palm, but it represented more wealth than most prospectors found in months of searching. The discovery raised profound questions about the nature of Rotgut's guidance. The donkey had led them to shelter from a dangerous storm, but that shelter happened to contain mineral wealth. Was this coincidence or something more purposeful? Elias studied the silver-veined quartz sample in his palm while rain continued to drum against the mountainside outside. His father's journal contained several passages about recognizing divine providence when it appeared, often in forms that tested a man's ability to see beyond surface appearances. "If this is guidance," he said quietly to Rotgut. "Then I need to understand what I'm supposed to do with it." The storm passed by late afternoon, leaving the air clean and cool, and the landscape transformed by rushing water. Elias carefully wrapped his quartz sample in cloth and tucked it into his saddlebags before emerging from the cave. The narrow cleft that had provided their salvation was now barely visible again, hidden by shadows and the angle of the rock face. As they resumed their journey, Elias found himself thinking about the prospector who'd sold him Rotgut. Silas Boone had seemed like a man defeated by 20 years of failure, yet he'd possessed this remarkable animal without apparently recognizing its value. The irony was both sad and instructive. Sometimes the greatest treasures went unrecognized by those who held them. Meanwhile, back in Copper Ridge, Silas was discovering the true cost of his impulsive decision. Without Rotgut to carry supplies, his prospecting efforts had been reduced to what he could manage with his failing strength and arthritic joints. The $12 from the sale had lasted exactly 4 days before evaporating into food, lodging, and the persistent demands of creditors. Murphy had grown increasingly direct about the overdue rent. "I understand your situation, Silas," the boarding house owner had said that morning. "But understanding doesn't pay my bills. You'll need to settle your account by week's end, or I'll have to ask you to find other accommodations." Other accommodations meant sleeping rough in a territory where autumn nights already carried the bite of approaching winter. At 67, with joints that seized up in cold weather, Silas wasn't sure he could survive many nights in the open. His attempts to continue mining without pack animal support had proven both futile and humiliating. The tools and supplies he could carry on his back barely sufficed for surface scratching, let alone the serious digging required to reach promising depths. Worse, his physical limitations had become glaringly apparent without Rotgut's steady assistance on the rough terrain. Yesterday, he'd fallen twice on the trail to his claims, once badly enough to tear his trousers and scrape his knee raw. The realization that he could no longer safely navigate terrain he'd traversed for 20 years felt like a final indignity in a life increasingly defined by diminishment. But it was the loneliness that surprised him most. He'd thought of Rotgut as a burden, a contrary animal whose stubbornness complicated his efforts. Now he understood that the donkey had been his only constant companion through 2 decades of solitary labor. The silence on the trail, the absence of another living presence at his side, weighed on him more heavily than he'd expected. As Elias and Rotgut made camp for their second night together, the contrast between the two men's circumstances couldn't have been more stark. Where Silas faced eviction and destitution, Elias had stumbled upon mineral wealth and the growing certainty that his journey was guided by forces beyond his understanding. The silver-veined quartz sample lay wrapped in Elias's saddlebags like a promise of greater discoveries ahead. But more valuable than the precious metal was the lesson it represented, that sometimes the greatest treasures came to those who recognized blessing in unexpected forms. "Thank you," Elias said during his evening prayers, his father's cross warm in his hands, "for the reminder that your gifts often arrive disguised as ordinary circumstances. Help me remain worthy of whatever purpose you have for this journey." Rotgut stood at the edge of their camp with his usual watchful patience, but tonight his attention seemed focused on something beyond the immediate surroundings. The donkey's head was turned toward the deeper mountains, toward territory that promised both challenge and possibility. Elias followed the animal's gaze and felt a growing anticipation for whatever tomorrow might bring. The quartz sample had proven that Rotgut's guidance led to more than just safety and shelter. It led to genuine treasure. But something told him that the silver was just the beginning, a small foretaste of discoveries that would challenge everything. He thought he understood about blessing and purpose. 3 days deeper into the Sierra Madres, Elias discovered that his father's journal had been more than a collection of wandering thoughts. It was a carefully crafted map to places that existed, beyond the reach of conventional navigation. The terrain had grown increasingly rugged, with towering peaks that scraped the belly of passing clouds, and valleys so remote they seemed untouched by human presence. Rotgut's guidance had grown more deliberate as they climbed higher. The donkey no longer simply chose better routes. He led them to specific destinations with the purposefulness of someone following a memorized path. Water sources appeared exactly when their supplies ran low. Sheltered camping spots presented themselves at the end of each day's travel. Game trails provided passage through otherwise impassable terrain. On the morning that would change everything, Elias sat beside a small fire examining a photograph that had been pressed between the pages of his father's journal. The image, a formal daguerreotype taken before the war, showed three people posed stiffly in front of a photographer's painted backdrop. His father as a young man, barely recognizable without the lines that war would etch around his eyes. His mother, dead now 15 years. And himself as a boy of perhaps 10, serious-faced and uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. The photograph was faded and cracked, its silver surface clouded with age, but it remained his most precious possession. It represented the life his father had fought to preserve, the future he died hoping to secure. Looking at it reminded Elias why his current journey mattered, not for personal gain, but as part of a larger purpose that connected him to those who'd come before, and those who might come after. "This is what it's about," he said quietly to Rotgut, who stood nearby cropping the sparse mountain grass. "Building something that lasts longer than yourself, creating blessing that extends beyond your own circumstances." As if responding to these words, Rotgut lifted his head and gazed toward a narrow canyon that Elias hadn't noticed the previous evening. The passage was nearly invisible, hidden behind a screen of boulders and stunted pines. But the donkeys. Attention drew Elias to examine it more carefully. What he discovered defied both expectation and explanation. The canyon opened into a hidden valley, perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, completely enclosed by towering cliffs that would have made it invisible from any surrounding peak. A clear stream meandered through the valley floor, fed by springs that emerged from the rock walls at several points, but it was the geology that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. The entire valley showed signs of mineralization so extensive it looked like something from a prospector's fever dream. Quartz veins ran through the exposed rock faces like frozen rivers, many showing the telltale glint of precious metals. Scattered across the valley floor were chunks of ore so rich they needed no processing to reveal their silver content. "Lord, have mercy," Elias whispered, dismounting to examine the nearest outcrop. The rock came away in his hands, heavy with metal, beautiful in its raw abundance. This isn't just a claim, this is an entire mountain made of treasure. For several minutes he simply stood in the center of the valley, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Rotgut had led him to discover. This wasn't the modest find that might sustain a man through winter. This was wealth sufficient to transform lives, to build communities, to leave legacies that would endure for generations. The implications were staggering. He could live like a king for the rest of his days. He could fund any venture, support any cause, provide for any need that captured his imagination. The photograph in his hands suddenly seemed prophetic. His father had died, believing that purpose and blessing would eventually intersect in his son's life, and that intersection had apparently arrived in the form of this impossible valley. But as Elias examined the scattered wealth around him, his father's words from the journal echoed in his memory. True treasure isn't what a man can accumulate for himself, but what he can share with others who have greater need. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over distant peaks. This discovery wasn't meant for him alone. The vast wealth spread across the valley floor represented opportunity, not just for personal enrichment, but for addressing the kind of suffering he'd witnessed in places like Copper Ridge. where men like Silas Boone struggled with dignity against circumstances beyond their control. Rotgut watched him with the patient attention of a creature who understood more than he could express. The donkey's calm demeanor suggested that this discovery, extraordinary as it seemed, was exactly what he'd been guiding them toward from the beginning. "You knew," Elias said to the animal. "Somehow you knew this was here." As he explored the valley more thoroughly, Elias found evidence that others had been here before, but long ago and briefly. Ancient petroglyphs on one cliff face suggested Native American knowledge of the place, though the symbols seemed to indicate spiritual significance rather than mining activity. A few scattered artifacts, arrowheads, pottery fragments, confirmed human presence, but also suggested reverence rather than exploitation. The valley felt sacred in a way that went beyond its material wealth. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle sound of moving water and the whisper of wind through the pines. Standing there, Elias understood why his father's journal had contained so many spiritual observations. Some places existed at the intersection of earthly and divine purpose, and this hidden valley was clearly one of them. Meanwhile, 60 miles away in Copper Ridge, Silas Boone was discovering the full consequences of his decision to sell Rotgut. Murphy had finally lost patience with promises and half-payments, evicting him from the boarding house with nothing but the clothes on his back and the few possessions he could carry in a single canvas bag. The prospect of sleeping rough in mountain country with winter approaching would have been daunting for a younger man. For someone approaching 70 with failing health and no income, it felt like a death sentence. Silas had spent his first night in an abandoned mine shaft, shivering in the thin blanket that represented his only protection against the cold. His former neighbors and fellow prospectors offered varying degrees of sympathy, but no practical help. Everyone in Copper Ridge was struggling with their own survival, and charity was a luxury few could afford. The general store owner allowed him to sleep behind the building in exchange for sweeping the front walk, but made it clear this was a temporary arrangement. "You need to find family, Silas," the shopkeeper had advised. "This isn't a place for a man with no prospects and no support." But Silas had no family, no friends outside this small mining community, no skills that would serve him in other places. 20 years in the territory had given him expertise in a single field, prospecting, and even that had proven inadequate to his needs. As he huddled in his makeshift shelter that third night, Silas found himself thinking about Rotgut with a mixture of regret and resentment. The donkey had been stubborn and contrary, but he'd also been steady companionship in a harsh and lonely existence. More practically, he'd provided the physical capability that made prospecting possible for an aging man. The $12 had vanished as quickly as desert water, leaving behind only the flask that now served as Silas's primary solace. Each drink burned his throat and clouded his judgment, but it also temporarily dulled the growing certainty that he'd made the worst decision of a life filled with poor choices. Back in the hidden valley, Elias spent his first evening cataloguing the wealth that surrounded him while contemplating the responsibilities that came with such blessing. His father's photograph lay open beside his campfire, a reminder that true legacy wasn't measured in accumulated treasure, but in lives touched and circumstances improved. "Help me understand what you want me to do with this," he prayed, holding his father's cross as darkness settled over the mountains. "Because I know it isn't meant for my benefit alone." Rotgut stood at the edge of the camp with his usual watchful patience. But tonight, there was something different in his posture. A sense of completion, as if he'd accomplished the task he'd been given. The donkey had led them to treasure beyond imagination, but Elias suspected that the real test lay not in finding the wealth, but in determining how to use it wisely. Word of significant silver discoveries traveled fast in mining country, carried by traders, drifters, and the network of men who made their living connecting remote settlements with the outside world. Within 2 weeks of Elias's arrival in the hidden valley, rumors had reached Copper Ridge about a mysterious prospector who'd struck it rich somewhere in the eastern peaks. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the stranger had found a mountain made entirely of silver. Others insisted he'd discovered Spanish treasure, buried by conquistadors and hidden for centuries. A few whispered about supernatural assistance, that the man traveled with a spirit guide that led him to wealth beyond imagination. Silas heard these tales during his daily search for work, odd jobs, and charity that might keep him alive another day. Each embellished account felt like salt in an open wound, especially when well-meaning townsfolk asked if he'd encountered this legendary prospector during his own years in the hills. "Heard tell he bought his pack animal right here in town," MacDonald mentioned while Silas swept the general store's front steps in exchange for yesterday's bread. "Paid cash money for it too. Wonder who was lucky enough to make that sale?" Silas said nothing, but his hands trembled as he worked the broom. The growing certainty that Elias Kane was the mysterious prospector in the stories meant that his Rotgut, had led another man to the fortune that should have been his own discovery. The irony was crushing. For 20 years he'd hauled that donkey across every promising formation in the territory, and the animal had remained stubbornly ordinary. 3 weeks in the hands of a gentle stranger, and suddenly Rotgut was guiding someone to legendary wealth. Meanwhile, in the hidden valley, Elias had established a modest operation that balanced practical mining with careful stewardship of the remarkable discovery. He'd spent days crafting a proper halter for Rotgut, not from purchased materials, but from leather. He'd tanned himself using oak bark gathered in the lower elevations. The work was meditative, requiring patience and attention to detail that gave him time to think through the implications of his situation. Each careful stitch represented a small act of gratitude toward the animal who'd transformed his life. The finished halter was beautiful in its simplicity. Soft leather dyed deep brown, with brass fittings that gleamed like tiny suns. "This is how you should be treated," Elias said, as he fitted the new halter around Rotgut's head. "With respect and appreciation for what you bring to our partnership." The contrast with the worn rope halter Silas had used couldn't have been more pronounced. Where the old gear had been functional but harsh, this new equipment spoke of care and recognition, of the donkey's value. Rotgut seemed to understand the difference, carrying himself with a dignity that reflected his improved circumstances. Elias's mining technique differed significantly from the grab-and-run approach that characterized most prospecting operations. Instead of extracting everything as quickly as possible, he worked selectively, taking only what he needed while leaving the valley's natural beauty intact. His campsite remained modest, despite his newfound wealth. A simple tent, basic supplies, and tools maintained with care rather than replaced carelessly. This restraint wasn't born of stinginess, but of understanding. His father's journal had emphasized repeatedly that true blessing carried responsibility, and Elias felt the weight of that teaching as he worked among riches that could corrupt a less prepared soul. The silver he extracted went into carefully crafted storage, small leather pouches that could be easily transported when the time came to return to civilization. But he also set aside a separate collection, samples of the richest ore that would serve a different purpose entirely. These weren't for his own enrichment, but for the plan that was gradually taking shape in his mind. His evening prayers had evolved to include specific requests for wisdom about managing his discoveries responsibly. "Show me how to use this blessing to create more blessing," he would ask, holding his father's cross while Rotgut grazed nearby. "Don't let me become the kind of man who hoards what should be shared." The answer to those prayers came gradually through quiet reflection and careful reading of his father's journal. The war entries contained numerous accounts of soldiers who'd shared their rations with hungrier comrades, officers who'd used their authority to protect rather than exploit, and men who discovered that generosity multiplied rather than diminished their own resources. 3 weeks into his residence in the valley, Elias made a decision that would have seemed foolish to most men, but felt completely right to him. He would return to Copper Ridge, not to gloat over his success, but to address the suffering he'd witnessed there. Men like Silas deserved better than destitution in their declining years, and Elias now possessed the means to provide that better future. But first, he needed to understand more about the territory's history and the forces that had created such widespread hardship among honest working men. His father's journal contained references to economic patterns that seemed relevant: how boom and bust cycles affected communities, how individual prosperity meant nothing if the larger society remained struggling. Back in Copper Ridge, the pressure to locate the mysterious prospector's claims had intensified. Franklin Hess, the investor who'd rejected Silas's partnership proposal, had returned with survey equipment and a team of experienced miners. Others had followed, men with capital and determination who intended to find the source of the silver. Rumors through systematic exploration. The increased activity meant opportunities for day labor, and Silas had managed to earn enough for basic survival by guiding these search parties to areas he knew well. The work was humiliating, serving as a hired guide for men who dismissed him weeks earlier, but it kept him fed and sheltered. "You know these hills better than anyone," Hess had admitted grudgingly. "Where would someone go to find deposits that experienced prospectors missed?" The question tortured Silas because he thought he knew the answer. Rotgut had always shown interest in the eastern peaks, the areas too remote and difficult for conventional mining operations. If the donkey possessed some supernatural ability to locate treasure, those distant ranges would be exactly where he'd lead a trusting owner. But admitting this knowledge would require confessing his own role in the story, that he'd owned and sold the animal that was apparently guiding someone else to fantastic wealth. The humiliation of that revelation felt worse than his current poverty, so Silas kept his suspicions to himself while leading search parties in circles through picked-over territory. As autumn deepened toward winter, the contrast between Elias's growing prosperity and Silas's desperate circumstances continued to widen. One man had recognized blessing when it appeared in humble form, while the other had discarded the same blessing in a moment of bitter frustration. In the hidden valley, Elias worked steadily while contemplating his return to civilization. The leather halter he'd crafted for Rotgut represented more than gratitude. It symbolized the proper relationship between humans and the creatures in their care, based on respect rather than exploitation. "Soon we'll head back down the mountain," he told Rotgut one evening, "and when we do, we'll carry more than silver. We'll carry the chance to transform lives." The donkey's patient attention suggested understanding, or perhaps simple trust in the man who treated him with consistent kindness. Either way, Rotgut seemed ready for whatever journey lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that his current owner recognized his true value. The discovery came while Elias was working the richest vein in the valley, a silver deposit so pure it seemed to glow with its own light in the morning sun. As he carefully extracted ore from a natural pocket in the rock face, his pick struck something that rang with a different tone, not the dull thud of metal against stone, but a sharp, clear note that seemed to carry meaning beyond its physical source. Embedded in the silver-bearing quartz, as if placed there deliberately, was an arrowhead of black obsidian. The artifact was perfect in its craftsmanship, knapped with such skill that it seemed to capture and reflect light like a dark mirror. But what made Elias pause wasn't its beauty. It was the sense of intentionality surrounding its presence in this precise location. As he held the arrowhead up to examine it more closely, Rotgut approached with unusual purpose. The donkey, normally content to graze while Elias worked, walked directly to where his owner stood and nuzzled the artifact with unmistakable recognition. "You know what this is," Elias said quietly. studying the animal's reaction. "This means something to you." That evening, as Elias sat by his fire studying the arrowhead by lamplight, he opened his father's journal to a section he'd never fully understood, pages filled with notes about Native American spiritual practices encountered during the war. One passage, written in his father's increasingly shaky handwriting, now seemed prophetic. "Met an Apache medicine man today, dying from wounds received in yesterday's skirmish. Before he passed, he spoke of sacred animals, creatures chosen by the spirits to carry blessing from the old world to the new. Said these animals could recognize spiritual treasure as easily as material wealth, and that they would guide worthy men to discoveries that served purposes larger than personal gain. Thought it was fever talk then, but now I wonder if there are truths we don't understand operating in this territory." Elias read the passage 3 times, each reading deepening his certainty that Rotgut's abilities weren't coincidental. The donkey's behavior, his supernatural navigation skills, his ability to locate water and shelter, his guidance to this impossible valley, suddenly made sense within a larger spiritual framework. As if responding to this recognition, Rotgut walked to the edge of their camp and began pawing at a section of ground that showed no obvious significance. Elias followed with his lantern and discovered that the donkey had uncovered a flat stone marked with the same symbols he'd seen on the valley's cliff faces, petroglyphs that suggested this place had been sacred to indigenous peoples long before any European had dreamed of silver mining. The stone, when fully revealed, showed a carving of a man leading a pack animal toward a stylized mountain. Above them, symbols that might represent stars or spirits seemed to guide their journey toward a destination marked with concentric circles. The message was unmistakable. This valley had been known to earlier inhabitants, and they'd understood its significance in terms that went beyond material wealth. Elias spent the night in contemplation, turning the obsidian arrowhead over in his hands while studying the petroglyph by firelight. The artifact felt warm against his skin, as if it retained some essence of the spiritual power that had originally blessed Rotgut with his extraordinary abilities. By morning, he understood that his journey had always been about more than personal discovery. The valley, the silver, even Rotgut himself, all were part of a larger pattern designed to address suffering and create opportunity for those who'd been forgotten by conventional prosperity. His father's journal contained the practical guidance he needed for the next phase of his mission. Several pages outlined strategies for establishing mutual aid societies, cooperative enterprises that allowed working men to support each other through difficult times. Another section described the economic principles that could sustain such efforts, how shared resources multiplied individual capability and created stability that benefited entire communities. "I understand now," Elias said to Rotgut as they prepared for their eventual return to civilization. "You weren't just leading me to silver, you were leading me to purpose." Meanwhile, in Copper Ridge, Silas had reached the absolute bottom of his circumstances. The last search party had returned empty-handed and unpaid, leaving him without even day labor opportunities. Winter's approach had driven away all but the most desperate prospectors, and the town was contracting around its core of established businesses and permanent residents. Murphy had made it clear that Silas was no longer welcome even to sleep behind the boarding house. "It's nothing personal," the owner had explained, "but the other guests complain about the smell, and frankly, you're bad for business." The smell came from clothes that couldn't be properly washed, skin that couldn't be regularly cleaned, and the general decay that accompanied homelessness in a harsh climate. Silas had noticed people crossing the street to avoid him, conversations that stopped when he approached, the careful way shopkeepers watched him for signs of desperation that might lead to theft. His current shelter was an abandoned mine shaft 2 miles from town, a dark, cold hole in the ground that offered protection from wind but little else. The shaft had been played out years ago, leaving behind only the skeleton of its former promise. Broken timbers, rusted equipment, and the lingering smell of failed dreams made it an appropriate refuge for a man whose own dreams had collapsed so completely. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. For 20 years he'd searched these hills for the kind of wealth that would transform his life. Now, according to the stories circulating through town, that exact transformation was happening to someone else, possibly using the very animal he'd sold in a moment of bitter frustration. His last possession of any value was the journal that contained 2 decades of mining records. The leather cover was cracked and water-stained, the pages filled with the careful notations of a man who'd believed that persistence would eventually yield reward. Now it seemed like evidence of self-delusion rather than professional dedication. Sitting in the mouth of the abandoned shaft, Silas opened the journal to its final entries, records of the claims where Rotgut had seemed most reluctant to work. Reading them now, he began to see a pattern he'd missed at the time. The donkey hadn't been stubborn or contrary. He'd been trying to guide Silas away from worthless ground toward areas that might actually produce results. "I had 20 years to figure it out," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the mine shaft. 20 years to understand what that animal was trying to tell me. The recognition came too late to change anything, but it added the weight of personal responsibility to his current suffering. He hadn't just been unlucky or victimized by circumstances, he'd been blind to opportunity when it lived in his own corral. As the first snow began to fall on the peaks above Copper Ridge, Silas faced the likelihood that he wouldn't survive the winter. Without shelter, steady food, or income, the combination of cold weather and declining health would probably kill him before spring. The prospect didn't frighten him as much as it should have. Death might be preferable to continuing this daily struggle against insurmountable circumstances. In the hidden valley, Elias completed his preparations for return to civilization. The silver he'd extracted filled several leather pouches, enough wealth to fund his emerging plans for community assistance and cooperative enterprise. But more important than the material treasure was his growing understanding of the spiritual framework that had made this discovery possible. The obsidian arrowhead had become his constant companion, carried in the same pocket as his father's cross. Together, the 2 artifacts reminded him that his mission connected him to traditions of service that extended both backward to his family's legacy and forward to indigenous wisdom about recognizing sacred purpose in earthly circumstances. "We'll be leaving soon," he told Rotgut as they stood together in the center of the valley. "But we'll carry this place with us and everything it represents about using blessing to create more blessing." The donkey's calm attention suggested readiness for whatever came next. Rotgut had completed the task he'd been given, leading a worthy man to spiritual and material treasure. Now came the more challenging work of transforming that discovery into lasting benefit for others who needed hope more than they needed silver. The decision to return to Copper Ridge came to Elias during his morning prayers, as he held both his father's cross and the obsidian arrowhead while watching sunrise paint the valley walls with gold and crimson. For weeks, he'd been preparing for this journey, not just by gathering silver, but by contemplating how to honor the spiritual responsibility that came with such extraordinary blessing. His final preparations included creating a special pouch from the finest leather he could craft, stitched with patterns inspired by the petroglyphs he'd discovered throughout the valley. Inside this pouch, he placed exactly 100 silver coins, not raw ore, but finished currency that he'd traded. For during a careful journey to a distant settlement where his identity would remain unknown, each coin represented more than monetary value. As Elias placed them one by one into the soft leather pouch, he offered prayers for the men whose lives might be transformed by this wealth. The coins weren't intended for his own comfort or advancement, but as seed money for the cooperative enterprises his father's journal had described, ways for struggling prospectors to support each other through the inevitable lean periods. "Lord," he prayed as he sealed the pouch with careful stitching. Let this silver create opportunity rather than envy, hope rather than resentment. Help me use it as you would want it used. The physical preparation for departure required equal care. Elias had spent weeks studying the best routes back to Copper Ridge, choosing paths that would avoid the search parties still combing the eastern peaks for his mythical claims. His success depended on arriving quietly, without fanfare, so he could begin his work before word spread about his return. Rotgut seemed to understand the significance of their impending departure. The donkey stood patiently while Elias loaded their supplies, but his attention remained focused on the valley they were leaving behind. It was as if the animal recognized that this place had served its purpose in their journey, and was now ready to remain behind as a sacred space, protected by its remoteness and the spiritual forces that had originally blessed it. We'll carry what matters most with us, Elias assured him, adjusting the beautiful leather halter that had become a symbol of their transformed relationship. The silver is important, but what we've learned here matters more. As they made their way down from the high country, Elias reflected on how completely his understanding of wealth had evolved. 6 months ago, he'd imagined that finding his father's rumored treasure would solve his personal problems and provide security for his future. Now he understood that true treasure wasn't about accumulation, but about circulation, using blessing to create more blessing in an endless cycle of generosity. The journey to Copper Ridge took 4 days, following paths that avoided main trails and settlements where gossip might spread news of their passage. Elias had learned caution during his weeks in the valley, understanding that premature revelation of his success could create dangers for both himself and the people he intended to help. Each evening, as they made camp in isolated spots, Elias studied his father's journal for guidance about implementing cooperative enterprises in frontier communities. The practical details were complex. How to establish trust among men who'd grown accustomed to individual competition, how to create structures that encouraged participation without inviting exploitation, how to begin such efforts without attracting unwanted attention from those who might see cooperation as threat to their own interests. The answers lay not in elaborate planning, but in starting small, with modest assistance that addressed immediate needs while demonstrating the principles of mutual aid. The silver coins in his special pouch would provide the initial capital, but success would depend on his ability to show struggling men that their circumstances could improve through shared effort rather than individual desperation. Meanwhile, word of his approach had somehow reached Copper Ridge ahead of him. Travelers carried rumors, traders brought stories, and the network of men who connected remote settlements with civilization buzzed with speculation about the mysterious prospector's possible return. The silver he'd carefully traded for finished. Goods and supplies had created its own trail of gossip, leading back toward his original starting point. Silas heard these rumors during one of his increasingly desperate searches for work or charity. The conversation took place outside McDonald's store, where a group of men discussed the latest stories about the legendary prospector who'd supposedly discovered unlimited silver somewhere in the eastern peaks. Heard tell he's heading back. This way, one of the men mentioned. Fellow I met at the trading post said someone matching his description was seen provisioning for a journey toward Copper Ridge. Makes sense, another replied. Man finds that kind of wealth, he'd want to come back and buy up all the claims he can get his hands on, probably planning to become the richest man in the territory. Silas listened to this speculation with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. If Elias Kane was indeed returning, it would confirm his growing certainty that Rotgut had led another man to the fortune that should have been his own discovery. But it might also represent his last chance to somehow benefit from the relationship he'd foolishly severed. His current circumstances left him little room for pride or dignity. The approaching winter had already brought freezing nights that left him shivering in his inadequate shelter, Without steady income or proper clothing, he wouldn't survive many more weeks of declining temperatures. The prospect of confronting the man who'd purchased his donkey felt humiliating, but it might also represent his only hope for survival. "If he does come back," Silas said carefully, joining the conversation, "what kind of reception do you think he'll get?" The men looked at him with the mixture of pity and discomfort that had become familiar since his eviction from Murphy's boarding house. His appearance, unwashed, unshaven, wearing clothes that had seen too many days without proper care, marked him as someone whose opinions carried little weight. "Depends on what he wants," MacDonald replied diplomatically. "Man with that kind of wealth could do a lot of good for this community if he's so inclined. Could also cause a lot of trouble if he's the type to flaunt his success." The subtext was clear. Silas represented the kind of failure that successful men might use as either motivation for generosity or justification for superiority. His current circumstances made him a living reminder of how quickly fortune could reverse in this unforgiving territory. As the group dispersed, Silas found himself alone with his mounting anxiety about the confrontation that seemed inevitable. He'd spent weeks trying to convince himself that selling Rotgut had been a reasonable decision given his circumstances at the time. Now, faced with the possibility of encountering both the donkey and his new owner, those justifications felt increasingly hollow. The worst part was uncertainty about Elias Kane's character. Their brief interaction had suggested a man of unusual gentleness and consideration, but wealth had a way of changing people. The quiet cowboy who'd paid $12 for a donkey might have become something very different after discovering vast silver deposits. Success could turn generous men cruel and humble men arrogant, especially when they encountered reminders of their previous circumstances. Silas spent his nights in the abandoned mine shaft, staring into darkness while imagining various scenarios. For their reunion, in some, Elias would be generous, perhaps offering employment or assistance out of gratitude for the animal that had transformed his fortunes. In others, the successful prospector would be coldly dismissive, treating Silas as a cautionary tale rather than someone deserving consideration. The most terrifying possibility was that Elias would be indifferent, that the transformation of his circumstances had made Silas irrelevant rather than hateful. Being ignored might hurt worse than being rejected, especially by someone whose success had been built on the foundation of Silas's mistake. As Elias drew closer to Copper Ridge, his own thoughts centered on how to begin his mission without creating unrealistic expectations or dangerous resentments. The silver in his carefully crafted pouch represented enormous opportunity, but it also carried risks. Men driven by desperation could become dangerous if they felt excluded from sudden wealth, and Elias had no intention of creating divisions within a community that already struggled with sufficient challenges. His father's journal emphasized the importance of building trust gradually, through small acts of assistance that demonstrated good faith rather than grand gestures that might seem calculating or condescending. The cooperative enterprises he envisioned would work only if they grew organically from genuine relationships, rather than being imposed from outside by someone with superior resources. "We'll start quietly," he told Rotgut as they made their final camp before reaching Copper Ridge. "Help where we can, build trust where we must, and let the larger work develop naturally." The donkey's calm attention suggested understanding or perhaps simple faith in the man who'd treated him with consistent respect and kindness. Tomorrow would bring them back to the place where their partnership had begun, but both had been transformed by their journey into the high country. As Elias fell asleep beside his small fire, the leather pouch of silver coins rested against his chest like a promise of good work to come. Tomorrow would test everything he'd learned about the proper use of blessing, and everything he believed about the possibility of transforming individual fortune into community prosperity. The silver was just a tool, but it was a powerful one. How he used it would determine whether his discovery became a source of healing or division in a place where both were desperately needed. Elias Kane rode into Copper Ridge on a crisp November morning, leading Rotgut behind his horse with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. Word of his approach had somehow preceded him because a small crowd had already gathered in the town square by the time he dismounted at the hitching rail outside McDonald's store. The reception was a mixture of curiosity, speculation, and barely concealed avarice. Men who'd spent months searching the eastern peaks for his rumored claims now studied him with the intensity of prospectors examining promising ore samples. His simple clothes and modest equipment suggested either extraordinary humility or elaborate deception. "That's him," someone whispered. "That's the fellow who found the silver." Elias ignored the attention and began unloading supplies from Rotgut's pack with the same careful methodology he'd developed in the hidden valley. The donkey stood quietly despite the crowd, displaying the calm confidence that had become his trademark under Elias's patient care. From across the square, Silas Boone watched the scene with emotions too complex for easy description. 6 weeks of destitution had transformed him from a struggling but dignified prospector into something approaching a human wreck. His clothes hung loose on a frame that malnutrition had reduced to sharp angles and prominent bones. His hands, once steady enough for delicate mining work, now trembled from a combination of poor nutrition, harsh weather, and the flask that had become his primary source of comfort. But seeing Rotgut again, healthy, well-groomed, and obviously thriving, under better care, triggered something deeper than simple regret. The donkey represented the last connection to his former life, to the 2 decades when he'd still believed that persistence and hard work might eventually yield reward. Silas pushed through the crowd with unsteady steps, driven by desperation that had been building for weeks. In his right hand, he carried the broken handle of his old mining pick, the only tool that had survived his recent series of evictions and losses. The wooden handle had snapped during his last unsuccessful attempt at solitary prospecting, leaving behind a splintered shaft that seemed to symbolize the wreckage of his dreams. "That's my donkey," Silas announced loudly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once commanded respect in this community. "That animal belongs to me." The crowd fell silent, recognizing the drama that was about to unfold. Everyone knew Silas's story, the gradual decline from hopeful prospector to desperate vagrant, and many had suspected a connection between his circumstances and the mysterious stranger's success. Elias turned slowly, his expression showing no surprise. At the confrontation, "Mr. Boone," he said quietly, "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk." "Talk?" Silas's voice cracked with accumulated bitterness. "There's nothing to talk about. You bought stolen goods. That donkey was taken from me under false pretenses." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the desperation behind Silas's words, but uncertain about the justice of his claim. Elias reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the bill of sale they'd completed 6 weeks earlier. "I have the receipt for our transaction," he said calmly. $12 and a flask of whiskey, as agreed." "You knew," Silas said, his voice rising with each word. "Somehow you knew what that animal could do. You cheated me, took advantage of a man in desperate circumstances." The broken pick handle in Silas's hand began to shake as his emotions overwhelmed his weakened self-control. The tool that had once represented his livelihood now seemed like a weapon, though everyone present understood that his physical condition made him incapable of actual violence. "I paid what you asked," Elias replied, his tone remaining steady despite the growing tension. "Our agreement was fair and legally binding." "Fair?" Silas laughed bitterly. "You knew what you were buying, knew it would make you rich while I starved in an abandoned mine shaft." The detail about his current living conditions drew murmurs of Sympathy from the crowd, but also confirmed what many had suspected about Silas's circumstances. The contrast between his obvious suffering and Elias's apparent prosperity made the scene both tragic and morally complex. Rotgut, who had been standing quietly throughout the confrontation, suddenly lifted his head and gazed directly at his former owner. For a moment, the donkey's dark eyes seemed to hold recognition and something that might have been sadness. But when Silas stepped toward him, Rotgut moved closer to Elias, rather than showing any desire to resume their old relationship. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. The donkey had made his choice, and it wasn't the man who'd cursed him for 3 years as worthless and contrary. Even he knows, Silas said, his voice breaking. Even the animal knows. I threw away the only blessing I ever had. The admission stunned the crowd into silence. Silas had always been proud, stubborn in his refusal to admit defeat even when circumstances clearly favored surrender. Hearing him acknowledge his mistake so publicly revealed the depths of his despair. Elias studied the broken man before him, the trembling hands, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that had lost their capacity for hope. This wasn't the dignified prospector who'd sold him Rotgut 6 weeks ago. This was someone who'd been ground down by circumstances until nothing remained but desperation and regret. "Mr. Boone," Elias said quietly, "I think we should discuss this privately, away from all these folks." But Silas was beyond caring about dignity or privacy. 6 weeks of accumulated frustration and self-loathing had reached a breaking point that demanded public resolution. "No," he said, raising the broken pick handle like a gavel. "Let everyone hear how Silas Boone lost his last chance at redemption because he was too blind to recognize blessing when it stood in his own corral." The broken pick handle fell from Silas's trembling fingers, clattering against the hard-packed earth of the town square like the final note of a song that had played too long. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, emphasizing the magnitude of his public confession and the complete collapse of his remaining dignity. 20 years, Silas continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the still air. 20 years I dragged that animal across every worthless claim in this territory, and he tried to tell me. Every time he balked, every time he refused to go where I wanted, he was trying to save me from myself. The crowd watched in uncomfortable fascination as one of their community's longest-standing members stripped away the last vestiges of his pride. Some faces showed sympathy, others displayed the kind of morbid curiosity that drew people to watch. "Buildings burn or accidents unfold," Elias stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the broken man without any sign of triumph or superiority. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a small wooden box, carefully crafted and polished to a warm glow. The box bore the same patient attention to detail that characterized everything in his possession, evidence of care rather than haste, quality rather than expedience. "Mr. Boone," he said gently, "I brought something that might help with those hands." Silas looked down at his arthritic fingers, swollen and gnarled from decades of hard labor, made worse by recent exposure and malnutrition. The joints ached constantly, now a persistent reminder of his body's gradual surrender to time and hardship. "Open it," Elias encouraged, extending the box toward him. With shaking hands, Silas lifted the lid to reveal an assortment of dried herbs, small bottles of oil, and what appeared to be medicinal preparations. The contents were arranged with the same care that characterized everything else in Elias's possession, each item labeled in clear handwriting. "For the arthritis," Elias explained quietly, "and the other ailments that come from living rough. I learned about these remedies from a medicine woman in the high country. They won't cure everything, but they might ease the worst of it." The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to what Silas had anticipated, that he found himself speechless. He'd prepared for gloating, for dismissal, for the kind of cold satisfaction that successful men sometimes displayed toward those they'd surpassed. He hadn't prepared for compassion. "Why?" Silas managed to ask. "Why would you help me after what I said?" Elias was quiet for a moment, considering his response, while the crowd strained to hear every word of this extraordinary exchange. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because I understand what it means to be desperate," he said, "and because that donkey taught me something about recognizing value that isn't immediately apparent." The reference to Rotgut made Silas glance toward the animal, who stood watching the proceedings with his usual calm attention. The donkey's presence seemed to anchor the moment, reminding everyone present that this confrontation had begun with questions about ownership and justice. "I can't pay you for medicine," Silas said, his voice thick with shame. "I can't pay for anything." "I'm not asking for payment," Elias replied. "I'm offering partnership." The word hit the crowd like a physical blow. Partnership implied equality, mutual benefit, respect between participants. It was the last thing anyone expected to hear offered to a man who just admitted to squandering the opportunity of a lifetime. Silas stared at Elias as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Partnership? I've got nothing to offer anyone. No claims, no equipment, no money. I'm living in an abandoned mineshaft and begging for day labor." "You've got 20 years of experience in this territory," Elias pointed out. "Knowledge of the geology, the water sources, the best places to work and the ones to avoid. That's worth something to a man who's new to the area." The offer hung in the air between them, as unexpected as summer snow. Around them, the crowd processed this development with varying degrees of surprise and skepticism. Some recognized the extraordinary generosity of the gesture, while others wondered what ulterior motive might lie behind such apparent magnanimity. Silas felt something break inside him, not his spirit, which had been broken for weeks, but the hard shell of bitterness that had formed around his heart since selling Rotgut. For the first time in months, he felt the unfamiliar sensation of hope trying to establish itself in the ruins of his dreams. "I don't understand," he said, looking from Elias to the donkey and back again. "I sold you that animal for $12 and a flask of whiskey, used the money for food and used the whiskey to forget what I'd done. Why would you want to help someone who was too stupid to recognize his own blessing?" Elias smiled slightly, an expression that held understanding rather than condescension. "Because sometimes the Lord sends second chances in forms we don't expect, and because I think Rotgut would approve." As if summoned by his name, the donkey stepped forward and nuzzled Silas's shoulder with the gentleness of an old friend offering comfort. The gesture brought tears to the old prospector's eyes, the first tears he'd shed since childhood, when crying had still seemed like a reasonable response to overwhelming circumstances. "I don't deserve this," Silas whispered, accepting the box of medicines with hands that trembled from emotion rather than weakness. "None of us deserve the blessings we receive," Elias replied quietly, "but we can choose to use them wisely once they arrive." The crowd began to disperse, sensing that the public drama had concluded and that whatever came next would be private business between two men who'd found unexpected common ground. As people drifted back to their daily routines, they carried with them a story that would be retold for years. How the richest man in the territory had offered partnership to the poorest, and how a stubborn donkey had somehow orchestrated the transformation of both their lives. 6 months later, the morning sun painted Copper Ridge in the same amber hues that had greeted Silas Boone during his darkest days. But the town itself had undergone a transformation that reflected more than changing seasons. The mining cooperative that Elias and Silas had established was now providing steady work for 12 men, their families, and the businesses that supported them. Silas emerged from the small but comfortable cabin he now shared with Elias, carrying a new leather-bound Bible that had arrived with the previous week's supply wagon. The book bore an inscription in Elias's careful handwriting, "For Silas Boone, who taught me that second chances are the Lord's specialty." May this book remind you daily that redemption is always possible for those who seek it with humble hearts. The Bible represented more than a gift between partners. It symbolized the spiritual transformation that had accompanied Silas's material rescue. The medicines Elias had provided had indeed eased his arthritis and restored his physical capabilities, but it was the daily example of grace and generosity that had healed his deeper wounds. Their mining operation was unlike any other in the territory. Instead of the traditional approach of individual claims worked in isolation, they'd created a cooperative system where shared labor produced shared rewards. Men who might otherwise compete for scarce resources now pooled their efforts and divided the profits according to contribution and need. The silver that funded this enterprise came from carefully managed expeditions to Elias's hidden valley, undertaken only when community needs required additional capital. Rather than strip mining the remarkable deposit for maximum immediate profit, they extracted only what was necessary to sustain their cooperative enterprises and assist families facing hardship. Rotgut had become something of a local legend, treated with the respect due a creature whose supernatural abilities had transformed multiple lives. The donkey still displayed his remarkable instincts for navigation and resource location, but now these gifts served the broader community rather than individual fortune seekers. On this particular morning, Silas found Elias in the small office where they maintained the cooperative's records. His partner was studying correspondence that had arrived from other mining communities, letters requesting guidance about establishing similar enterprises in their own territories. "Word continues to spread," Elias reported, showing Silas the latest inquiries. "There's a group in Colorado that wants to send representatives to observe our operation. Another in Nevada that's asking for written instructions about organizing cooperative mining ventures." Silas nodded, still amazed by how their modest experiment had attracted attention from across the Western territories. The success of their approach, combining individual initiative with mutual support, had proven that prosperity didn't require the ruthless competition that characterized most mining operations. "What does your father's journal say about expanding the work?" Silas asked, referring to the guidance that had shaped their enterprise from the beginning. Elias opened the worn leather volume to a passage they'd discussed many times. "True wealth multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded. A man who lifts up his neighbors lifts up himself, but a man who climbs alone often discovers he has no one to celebrate his success or comfort his failures." The wisdom in those words had proven accurate in ways that exceeded their original expectations. The cooperative had indeed created prosperity for its participants, but more importantly, it had built a community where individual success contributed to collective well-being rather than creating resentment and division. Silas opened his new Bible to a page he'd marked the previous evening, reading aloud from Ecclesiastes. "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up." The passage had special meaning for him, representing not just his own rescue from destitution, but the principle that had guided their work together. No one in their cooperative was allowed to fall without assistance, and no one was permitted to rise without lifting others. "I've been thinking about that prospector who came through last week," Silas continued. "The one from Utah who reminded me of myself before I learned better. What do you think about offering him a position with the cooperative?" Elias smiled at the suggestion, recognizing how far his partner had traveled from the bitter, prideful man who'd sold Rotgut in a moment of desperation. The Silas, who now proposed helping struggling strangers, bore little resemblance to the man who'd spent 20 years cursing his circumstances and blaming external forces for his failures. "I think that's exactly what we should do," Elias agreed. "And I think Rotgut would approve. The donkey, as if summoned by his name, appeared in the office doorway with the quiet dignity that had become his trademark. Age and good care had given him a distinguished appearance, his grey coat now silver around the muzzle, his eyes holding the wisdom of a creature who'd witnessed remarkable transformations. Silas reached out to scratch behind Rotgut's ears, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 6 months. The relationship between man and animal now embodied the respect and appreciation that had been missing during their first 3 years together. "You know," Silas said reflectively, "I spent 20 years thinking this territory owed me something. Fortune, recognition, success on my own terms. It wasn't until I lost everything that I understood the real treasure had been walking beside me the whole time." The observation carried weight that extended beyond their personal circumstances. Throughout Copper Ridge and the surrounding mining communities, their story had become a teaching tale about recognizing blessing in unexpected forms and treating all of God's creatures with the respect they deserved. As they prepared for another day of work that would benefit not just themselves, but the growing network of families and businesses that depended on their cooperative, Silas reflected on the morning routine that had replaced his former pattern of solitary bitterness. Each day now began with reading from his Bible, followed by planning that considered community needs alongside business objectives. The silver they extracted from the hidden valley supported not just mining operations, but also a school for miners' children, a fund for families facing medical emergencies, and assistance for new arrivals who needed help establishing themselves in the territory. Tomorrow's supply run will include materials for the church bell, Elias mentioned, consulting their planning notes. The congregation has been waiting 6 months for that shipment. The church bell represented another aspect of their community-building efforts, supporting institutions that strengthened social bonds and provided spiritual guidance for people whose lives involved considerable physical hardship and economic uncertainty. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Copper Ridge, Silas settled into his evening routine of Bible reading while Rotgut grazed peacefully nearby. The scene embodied a contentment that had seemed impossible during his months of destitution, when survival from one day to the next had consumed all his mental and physical energy. Opening his Bible to the bookmark where he'd left off the previous evening, Silas found himself reading about the parable of the talents, the story of servants entrusted with their master's wealth, and the different ways they chose to use that trust. The passage resonated deeply with his own experience of finally learning to recognize and properly steward the blessings that had always been available to him. "Lord," he said quietly, "thank you for the reminder that your gifts often arrive wearing working clothes and speaking with voices we don't expect to hear. Help me never again be too proud or too blind to recognize the next blessing you send my way." In the distance, the sound of men finishing their workday and heading home to families who no longer worried about uncertain income created a peaceful symphony of community prosperity. It was the sound of blessing, recognized, accepted, and multiplied through the simple act of sharing it with others who needed hope more than they needed silver.